So welcome to this video on the Azure Resource Manager and how it works with infrastructure as a service, or VMs in the cloud specifically. The Azure Resource Manager really is the replacement for the old Azure Service Manager and various APIs. And the Azure Resource Manager actually works fantastic with infrastructure service, all those VMs. And my goal in this is just to really walk through what some of the changes are. And to start that, I want to look at how things used to be before the Azure Resource Manager and really what we're used to today. So as a foundational, we used to have a cloud service, and this was at the foundation of everything we did in Azure. So I would have this cloud service I would create. And that cloud service gave us a number of things. So it had a virtual IP. So this was an internet addressable IP address, and also with that was a DNS name. Something.cloudapp.net was the traditional DNS suffix. And the cloud service name had to be unique across all of Azure. So I would create this cloud service. Whatever I named it would be the DNS name. So whatever is my cloud service.cloudapp.net, it would have that virtual IP, which was an IP address routable on the internet. Within that, I would then create one or more virtual machines. Now those virtual machines would each get a dynamic IP address. And this was an IP address that was assigned from the cloud services IP range that I had no control over. I didn't get to pick what IP scheme I wished to use. It would normally be from the 10 dot or 100 dot. And it would just assign those virtual machines an IP address from that range, and it would enable virtual machines in the same cloud service to talk to each other. So let me just go back a second. So they could communicate. Additionally, what the cloud service enabled me to do was load balancing. So what I would do is that virtual IP address on the cloud service, I would create things called endpoints. And those endpoints enabled certain ports coming through that virtual IP that was owned by the cloud service to point to certain ports offered by particular virtual machines. For example, I could enable remote desktop access. I could publish a web server and various other things. And if I had multiple virtual machines that I want to offer the same service, then what I could actually do was have that endpoint that I create pointing to multiple virtual machines within it. So it would effectively load balance. It could do some scaling as well. It could enable me to stop and start virtual machines based on certain CPU metrics or queue depths. So cloud services gave me those things. Now, optionally, I could use a virtual network. Imagine right now I have two different cloud services with their own virtual IPs and various virtual machines running inside them. They wouldn't be able to communicate. There'd be no name resolution between cloud services. Now, VMs within a cloud service, Azure offers its own automatic DNS, so it enables name resolution between VMs in the same cloud service. But if I have two different cloud services, there's no communication between them. There's no name resolution between them. The only way they could communicate would be via those virtual IP addresses over the internet. So optionally, what I could do was create this virtual network. So I would create the virtual network first. Within a virtual network, I can define what IP space I want to use. Now, normally this would be from the RFC 1918, so the 10 dot, the 192.168.172.16. It doesn't have to be. If you're a company that owns its own Class B or something, you can actually bring a portion of that IP space with you. The important thing is that IP space you use in the Azure Virtual Network must not clash with what you use on premises, because if later on I want to connect them together, well, that wouldn't work very well if they were overlapping. So I want to use an IP space in the Azure Virtual Network that I don't use on premises. So I create the Azure Virtual Network first, and then I go and create virtual machines in cloud services. And the first virtual machine I create in a brand new cloud service dictates if that's in a virtual network or not. So when I create the VM, I can select, do I want to create that VM in the brand new cloud service in a region, or do I want to create it in a virtual network? When I do that, it basically ties that cloud service to the virtual networks. Then every other VM I create in that cloud service would have to be part of that same virtual network. Now what this enables is, well, firstly, not only do I get to set the IP space that I use, I can configure the DNS servers to be used. So I now get flexible configuration there. All the VMs, even in different cloud services, can now communicate. So yes, they're still getting IP addresses from that pool. They're still configured by DHCP, but now they've got complete communication between them. And I can go a step further. I can create VPN gateways. So I could now connect this to my on-premises. I could connect it to other virtual networks. I could use ExpressRoute. If I did connect it to on-premises, well, I might change the DNS configuration of that virtual network to use my on-premises domain controllers for DNS. So I get a consistent DNS name services. So this is still just the old model. This is the Azure Service Manager. This is the cloud service as the foundation of everything. And typically, we want to use a virtual network. So why do I even want to think about changing? What's not great about this? If you've ever tried to do more than one thing at once, you'll find you're very limited. Parallel actions really don't exist. If you try and start a VM in a cloud service and then try and start another VM, it will error. It will basically say, hey, there's current locks going on. I can't do anything else. So parallel activities are severely limited. There's a component called an availability set. Basically what this does is, if I think about an Azure data center, I have racks and racks of servers. Well, things happen, things fail. So if I'm deploying multiple IaaS servers or multiple domain controllers or multiple SQL servers, I don't want them all put on the same rack, because maybe that rack has a failure, maybe a blade has a server failure. So I want to make sure if I deploy multiple instances of a service, which I need to do for my service level agreement, I want them put on different racks or fault domains, because something bad can happen. So an availability set enables me to create this availability set construct. I put VMs in the availability set, and that tells Azure, well, because these VMs are in the same availability set, they're offering the same service. I need to split those over 2 different fault domains, and 2 is the maximum. So even if I added 8 virtual machines all running IaaS to an availability set, I would be split over 2 fault domains. I'd have 4 on each. Well, that could cause problems for applications that were quorum based, because quorum says I want the majority. Well, if I can only split 2 ways, generally I'd have half and half, which would not be quorum. So that was a problem, the fact that I only had 2 fault domains for my availability set. They were XML-based imperative deployments without any kind of understanding of dependencies. It didn't understand that, well, maybe this service depended on the SQL VM to be created first. It really wasn't very flexible. And in fact, what happened is most VMs deployed were single cloud service deployments. People didn't really understand what was going on. The cloud service really is an artifact of platform as a service, which is where Azure started. There's no role-based access control. I can't be granular. You're an owner and a co-administrator, or you're a nobody. I can't really do anything more flexible than that. And there's no concept of a shared lifecycle for resources. I can't say, well, these 5 different resources are really part of the same thing, so let's treat them as one. I can't do that. And so in flies to save us Azure Resource Manager. There's its little cape flapping around. This is going to solve those problems. This has been a completely re-architected way to manage the resources within Azure. And really what this does is, as the name suggests, it focuses around the resources, which are any kind of Azure entity, a website, a storage account, a VM, all these different things. And now what happens is we have this container called a resource group. And a resource can only be a member of one resource group. I don't nest them. I can't have a particular resource in more than one resource group. A resource exists in one, always, and only one resource group. But I can now do these massive parallel actions. I can do huge deployments. I can deploy 100 VMs all in parallel. So the time it would take me in the old Azure Service Manager model to deploy 2 VMs, I can probably deploy 100 now using the Azure Resource Manager. It's really designed for these massive deployments. Now, the old Azure portal does not understand the Azure Resource Manager. It does not understand resource groups. So we're going to be using what at time of recording is the preview, the new portal. So I will see those through that new portal. Resource groups can span regions. They can be heterogeneous, so I could have a SQL database, a website, a virtual machine, all in the same resource group. Or they could be homogeneous. I may just have VMs in one, and maybe even only VMs of a certain project in one. Because the goal of these resource groups is they're going to be a container for different types of resource. And I'm going to use it for billing, for lifecycle, for that role-based access control. So I'm going to use it in lots of different ways. So this is very powerful. I can tag my resources. These are kind of key value pairs that I can create. And again, that's going to be visible in things that I do when I want to search. When I want to do my billing, I can see those tags. I could create a project tag and then give it different values. The deployments are now JSON-based templates, and it fully understands dependencies. It's going to be able to go and work out, hey, well, this resource depends on this resource. So when I deploy this thing, I need to deploy this first because this other thing depends on that. It's going to auto-populate. And they're going to resume. So the great thing about these is they're idempotent, which means if I'm doing something and it fails halfway through, for example, it will carry on. If I restart it, it's not going to cause any damage. I can redo operations. It's smart enough to realize that and just restart whatever process it needs to do depending on where it was in that deployment. I don't have to write code to check, well, was this done already? Okay, well, this bit was done. Let's go on to the next bit. Don't need to do that. These templates will just automatically carry on. If it fails, I just restart it. Now today, I cannot mix workloads, i.e. I cannot have ARM and non-ARM in the same thing. I can't use a non-ARM storage account with an ARM virtual machine. This may change in the future, but for right now, I can't mix. So I need basically ARM virtual networks. I need ARM storage accounts. I create ARM virtual machines, and I can see this in the portal because I'll see a V2. So let's just jump over to that. So here I'm looking at the new Azure portal. I selected browse, and if I browse, what we see is a number of V2 things. So the V2 things are those ARM. So I have ARM availability sets. I have ARM load balancers. I have ARM network interfaces. So I do things differently. I have ARM public IP addresses, ARM storage accounts, virtual machines, virtual networks. So I see those only in the preview portal. In the old portal, I would not see that. It wouldn't understand any concept. I should also see my resource groups. There we go. So these are all these new concepts around ARM. So what does it look like in an ARM world? So we start off, and there's a cloud service. Well, actually, there's not. We don't use cloud services in ARM. They've gone. Now, they're still there for things like platform as a service, but for infrastructure as a service, i.e. virtual machines, we do not use cloud services. They're a thing of the past, so forget about those completely. What we start with is a resource group. So I'm going to create a resource group, and that's kind of my container for everything else I'm going to do. Now, the order changes very much because I'm not using a cloud service, which means the cloud service, what did it do before? The cloud service gave us a virtual IP address. The cloud service had a DNS name. The cloud service did load balancing. The cloud service gave us availability via the scale. So that's all gone. The cloud service doesn't exist anymore. So now there's other things that have to kind of fill those gaps. So we create the resource group first, which again can contain resources from all over the world. Now I'm going to need a storage account. I'm going to need an ARM-based storage account. I'm also going to need the ARM-based virtual network. Remember, I cannot use the non-ARM ones. If you've already got a virtual network, that's great, but it's not going to work with ARM. So I'm going to create an ARM storage account. I'm going to create an ARM virtual network. Now this is different. The first thing I'm going to do now is I've got my virtual network. I'm going to create a virtual network adapter. So before I even create the virtual machine, I'm actually going to create a network adapter. That network adapter is what I'm going to place in the virtual network. Remember, I can actually use virtual networks from other resource groups. So I don't have to think about having to have a virtual network for every resource group I used. I could have a resource group that maybe just contain my virtual network, and I can go and create my VMs and other resources in different resource groups. They can still refer to those virtual networks. So I create my network adapter. I then create my virtual machine and link it to the network adapter I created. Now, what about if I want internet connectivity? Well, the first option is I can just use a instance level public IP address. Now, this was available in the Azure Service Manager model, even if it was in a cloud service. So I can basically give a virtual machine a public IP address of its own. Now, obviously, I'm going to use a lot of IP addresses if I do this. So the other option, what about those load balancing type things? So I can create an availability set. It's now a different construct. I create my VM, so I created 2 new network adapters, I created 2 new VMs. I then create a load balancer object. It's a separate object. I allocate it a virtual IP address, and then I can basically create NAT rules to forward traffic through that load balancer to certain virtual machines. That's the new model. So I can still accomplish the same thing. In fact, I have far more flexibility. I'm not limited now by this cloud service thing. But it does change the way I think about working. So I can either just give a VM an instance level public IP address, or I just create VMs, I create a load balancer, and then instead of endpoints, they're called NAT rules, and I point to ports and certain virtual machines. Now, the way I do this, let's say there's different ways. So the first thing is I can just do in PowerShell. And just before that, just to be very clear. So I think about the translation of technologies. The DNS name that used to be part of the cloud service is now just part of a VIP assigned to a load balancer. So that can have a name such as a domain, a region, cloudapp.azure.com. So cloudapp.net is kind of going away. The new name is cloudapp.azure.com. The container is actually now I create an availability set. And the great news is with the Azure Resource Manager, these availability sets can now span 3 fault domains. So for those quorum-based applications, good news. Now I have 3 fault domains. Load balancer is now a discrete object that reference those virtual network adapters. And I can assign a VIP to load balancer or an instance level public IP directly to a VM. Endpoints are gone. They're now just NAT rules on a load balancer. VMs are always placed in a virtual network. So whereas in the sort of the Azure Service Manager, the cloud services, a virtual network was optional, it's now mandatory. You cannot create an Azure Resource Manager VM not in a virtual network. Now I can do this in PowerShell. And you can. And I can do it one bit at a time. And this is all the PowerShell I would have to do. So what I'm going to do is just open this up in a window and just walk through this in a bit more detail. So the first thing I have to do is obviously get the Azure PowerShell module. So you can just go and download this. If you just search on Bing for install Azure PowerShell, this is kind of the first hit. And the link you want is this Microsoft Web Platform installer. If you click that, it opens up the install the Azure PowerShell commandlets and you're good to go. So once you've installed those, the first thing you're going to do is import. Actually, it just makes it a little bit bigger to make sure you can see well. I'm going to import the Azure module. And I just redid this morning. So I should be running the latest 9.4. Now with the old Azure Service Manager, I could authenticate to Azure using a certificate. This does not work with Azure Resource Manager. Because of the role-based access control, etc., I have to authenticate actually with an account. This can be an Azure AD account. This can be a Microsoft account. So we run the Add Azure account. This opens up a little window. I type in, and there are ways to do this offline. I've actually got a number of facts about this with PowerShell and saving credentials, etc., etc. A Microsoft account. Basically, just carry on, you type in your password, you go through all of this stuff. So I'm now authenticated. Now I would actually go and switch the mode, so I have to do this. I'm going to switch the mode to Azure Resource Manager. This is actually a new warning. And basically this is all around that the Azure Service Manager is being deprecated. And so that functionality will be moving actually away. So you will just use the Azure Resource Manager. So you won't have to do this at some point in the future. I can go ahead and set my subscription just as you would do, nothing special. So now let's actually go and look at creating with PowerShell. There's a lot of different things happening here. It's quite busy. But basically, I'm just setting a number of variables, a VM size, a location, a resource group name, a VM name. I'm picking a storage account and a storage type. So I'm going to go and create new ones. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a new storage account with a resource group name, storage account name, a location, and a type, all based on those variables. And I just create a variable that references that new storage account I just created. Now I want to create a new VM. So I'm creating a new virtual machine config for the name of my VM and the virtual machine size. Now one of the cool things here is I can actually create virtual networks from the PowerShell. So I'm creating a new Azure Virtual Network subnet configuration. Then I'm actually creating a new Azure Virtual Network using those subnets I just created. And then I'm getting a variable to that and getting the subnet ID. Next, I'm actually going to create a virtual machine NIC. So I'm creating a new Azure network interface connected to the resource group and connected to that subnet ID in that virtual network. And then I'm just grabbing the ID. Then I'm assigning it to my virtual machine. So I created that virtual machine config. I'm adding this NIC to my virtual machine. Now I'm just going ahead and I'm setting a name for the VHD I want to create. I'm going and creating a user, a password, there's a secure string, a bunch of really other stuff around the storage, some configurations, which SKU I wish to use, the publisher name, the offer, the version of the image. These are all the images in the libraries. And I just go and create the VM. Now, this is actually very different. If you select this Azure VM source image, the publisher name, the offer, the SKUs, the version, this is all very new. We used to just be able to say, hey, show me all the images. I actually can't do that anymore. I can't just say, hey, show me all the images. I have to kind of do it piece by piece. Now, I wrote a FAQ all about this. Again, if you search, you'll see that how can I view available images in Azure using ARM. Let me just search for that quickly. So if I search for Savile, how can I view all available images in Azure? There we go. So it's the first hit. So actually, that was the old way. So first hit is the old way. The second one is using ARM. I should have typed that in. So I walked through the commands to show them in ARM. So it's right there. And what I'll do is I'll just quickly walk through that just so you can see. 'Cause I think it's one of the more complicated parts of it. So the first thing we need to do is look at all the publishers. So I'm going to open up a new little window here and paste this code in. I didn't paste very well. So what I can do is I can take a look at all the publishers. So this is going to show me all the various publishers. Okay, so the reason that's erroring is because I've obviously not run all of this script. So over here, I actually have a location. So let me just paste in this part. So I'm trying to see the images in a certain location. So let's see the ones in East US. So this will show me the publishers. So there's a lot of different companies that are publishing these templates. And what I care about is the Microsoft Windows Server, this one. So I'm now setting my publisher to Microsoft Windows Server. And now I want to see, well, show me all the image offers in this location for this publisher. So I can see I have an offer of Windows Server. So great, I'm going to set the offer to Windows Server. So now show me all the SKUs of Windows Server from a publisher, Microsoft Windows Server, in that location. So now I can see, okay, I got Server 2008 R2, 2012 R2, and a technical preview. So now I want to see where the SKU is the 2012 R2 data center. And now I can see I have those various different versions. And at this point, I can pick one. So I just add a version to see the detail about a particular one. So that's just how I can find the exact image. So all of that was just to go and find, well, how can I reference that particular template? And that's what I then used in the virtual machine. And again, I have all of this in kind of separate facts. So I know I'm covering kind of a lot there. And obviously you can see it on the screen. But if I just open up the web browser again, so here's another fact. It's everything I just walked through. Switching the mode, all the PowerShell, and actually example of it running. So that's me just status code OK. I went ahead and actually created it based on that exact code. So I didn't change it. That code I just showed, the code that's in this article, is exactly what you need to run to create a VM in the Azure Resource Manager. So this is the code on how to find the various images. This is the code to actually create a V2 storage account and a virtual network, everything you need to do. So that's certainly one option. And you saw there's a lot to that, but once you've done it once, it's not a big deal. The other option is to use those templates I talked about. And this is where I can just go and download. There's a huge amount of these to get started, these JSON templates. I can just go to the GitHub to get them. Or Microsoft actually has a better formatted version of that. If I open up the web browser again, let's replace this one. I can go to the azure.microsoft.com documentation templates. And here's a list of templates they just have available. And there's various different complexities of them. But there's a bunch here. Or I can just go directly to the GitHub. And you'll notice the names. So there's 101s, there's 100s, there's 101s, then there's 201s. So the 101s are the ones to get started with. They're kind of the most basic. They show you the fundamentals. The 201s get more complex. Maybe they have dependencies. They have various other types of functionality. So when you're really starting off with this, think about starting off with the 101s. Get familiar with those. And just look at some of these. They really are a great place to start. Learn about the basics of them. And then you can try and create your own. You can modify theirs. So the best one I like to start with is there's a 101 Simple Windows VM. Now if you select this, you'll see there's a number of different files. And once again, everything I'm walking through here right now, as you're probably going to guess, I have a FAQ on. So let me just find that URL for you. If I put that over here, I walk through the entire process. So I even walk through the two URLs, the example 101. I walk through what each of the files do, connecting, downloading the templates, and then the makeup of the templates, everything I'm about to do. So a great way to get started. But you'll see there's a number of different files here. And what these files are for is they make up part of the template, when in reality, the only one I really have to have is the Azure deploy.json. This is the main bulk of the template. The README just basically creates me this nice page. It gives me this deploy to Azure. The parameters outlines what are the parameters that I pass to the template, i.e. my customizations, my configurations. So I can kind of pre-populate that parameter file and then pass it when I want to create the template. And then the metadata is just the basic data about the template. It's really used during the kind of publication. Enables me to use that template. So if we open one of these up, this is the main interesting one. See, there's a bunch of different parts to it. But it starts off with, well, what are the parameters I want to use? These are all the values I have to populate if I actually want to use this template. See, it wants a storage account name. It needs an admin username, a password, a name for the public IP, what OS version. And notice it's possible for them to have a default value and allowed values. And that's it. They're the things it expects to be able to use this template. Then there are variables. And I think the term variable is maybe a little bit misleading. They're more like constants. They're constants in this script. I can't change these anywhere. So these are just values that it's going to use elsewhere in this template. And then I have resources it's going to create. So it's going to create a storage account. It's going to create a public IP address. It's going to create a virtual network. It's going to create some subnets. It's going to create network interfaces. There's my IP config. And then it's going to create my VM. And that's it. It's going to use those various values. You can see things like, hey, it's using the storage and it's using references to images. It's going to create me an OS disk. It's using that network interface, the resource that it created earlier on in this template. So it's giving those dependencies. And basically all I do is I would just download this thing. I would specify this file. So I want to create maybe a new Azure Resource group. And if I open up that FAQ, I can actually probably quicker than trying to do it again here. I just specify that gallery template that I wish to use. So I'm going to use the Microsoft Windows 2012 Data Center template in this example. It features IntelliSense. It understands the parameters it's expecting. So it will prompt me for the ones that I need to use as part of that actual usage. If I just download it, so this is actually using it directly from the library via the GitHub. Or I can just download the file. When I do the new Azure Resource group, I tell it a template file name. So this is where I downloaded the content of that template file. So I actually just downloaded it. Don't know where that text has gone. I downloaded it to a file on my machine. And then I just leverage it there. So it's actually very easy. Once I get these, like I say, I have that nice IntelliSense. It's going to help me know what are the parameters I want. If I did download the parameter file, let me just go back a second. There we go. If I downloaded that parameters file, if I just open that up for a second, I can type in the values here, save it, and then when I go and create it, instead of typing those parameters in, I would just add the template parameter file as well and specify the file name where I gave it those values. And that would be the end of it. Then again, it would go and just create it. So again, I've referenced a number of different facts. This is how to create them with a template. This is how to list the images. This is how to create it with PowerShell. The real key point, though, is that I have so much more flexibility now. So it's just an example there. Happy dog. Make sure you authenticate with Azure AD, not certificates. Make sure you switch to the R mode currently. This is currently in preview, so there are some things that don't work right now, but that's going to get fixed along the way. Go and browse the templates. Go and look around. Once you feel comfortable with the 101s, the getting started ones, go and look at the 201s, the more advanced sort of concepts there. PowerShell is a great way to get going. You're probably going to use more of the JSON templates over time. Because again, that's what gives me that item potency. That's what gives me that repeatability rather than having to call the PowerShell. So where possible, use the JSON. I guess to summarize, cloud services are gone. Network adapters are now separate objects. I think about creating load balancers. everything is in a resource group and only one resource group. I have to use virtual networks. I hope this was useful. I appreciate your time. And I hope to see you again in another video. Thank you very much.